did, and that's how it injected itself in the middle. Is it frozen again, or is it? Okay. You keep going? Okay. And so now you're sending all your traffic through that. Okay. So now that it's injected itself and it's acting like the router, right? It's in fact you thinking you're talking to the router, but in reality you're talking to it. It's talking to the router and sending the traffic over. What the SSL stripping technique did was it ran another program that would listen to, in essence, like a proxy. And all the traffic that you would send over is if you went to a website and you asked for an HTTPS, you asked to actually initiate a secure session with the website, it would strip the HTTPS element and essentially change all the links and everything to HTTP, so you'd always communicate over HTTP through it, and it would talk HTTPS to the server. So it was acting as a client. And what it was doing is it was causing all the communication that you were sending along to be clear text, not ciphertext, clear text, through here. So it was able to read all your data. So this was a vulnerability in terms of being able to inject the man-in-the-middle attack. But more importantly, it was a vulnerability in that these websites allowed you, right, to come in and send secure information, sensitive information, I should say, over an unsecure channel, that's being HTTP. There's a workaround, and the workaround isn't specific to SSL, but it's related. There's a HSTS header that servers can now send that essentially says, I will not allow you, if you're a client, I'm not going to allow you to communicate to me without using a secure channel, right? So you can actually force to have a secure communication. So this is no longer valid if the servers support it and if the client enforces it. SSL stripper actually won't work because once you go in here and you've got some information, you're going to continue to go through and you're going to say, if I can't talk to the server securely, I'm not going to talk to the server, right? So there's a method of security there. The next one is Poodle, which is an interesting one. Again, this is a man-in-the-middle attack. If you're able to inject yourself in there, there's a lot of things that you could do. And that's, remember we talked about the fact that you could, in the older kind of versions of TLS, you can downgrade to SSL. Well, since SSL we know is an insecure protocol version, the man-in-the-middle would intercept the request to say, hey, do you support this? Do you support that, right? And what's in it, no, I only support these. And so what would happen here is that it would force the client to downgrade to SSL v3. And then once you do that, now allowing it to talk to the servers directly, but pin all the data. And in doing so now, you can go after the fact and read the data, right? Because you can crack it based on some of the known vulnerabilities in SSL v3. Things around that is browsers now are by default do not support SSL versions. They're in Force 1.1, 1.2, most of them 1.2 by default as the only. And then, so that's one methodology essentially that supports you there.
Even the settings are hidden there.
Even the settings. I mean, if you go into Firefox or Chrome and you try to go and find the settings to change this and enable, you can't find it. It's
Explorer, yes, you can
yeah.
find, but Firefox, Chrome, no.
Yeah. User beware with IE. I think even Edge is smart enough now to hide most of the stuff. Okay. So the next one is crime, and this is again vulnerability in SSL that was taken advantage of by a man-in-the-middle attack, and so what happens here is a user, we call them victims, goes in and visits a website that's got some malicious JavaScript, okay? And that initiates a connection to a third party, okay? This is known as cross-site request forgery, right? And so what's happening here now is it's going to go in and as it's sending some information to that website, there's a cookie. that's being sent, right? Because if you're authenticated to this, say you're authenticated to your bank and your session with your bank is still on, and you have a cookie that's basically identifying you as user X for your bank, as you're sending that, what it's doing is it's using specific algorithm that's used. If you're using a specific algorithm compression, what it's doing is it's able to use it by sending a bunch of requests out to this site and putting in some information, filling in some information in your cookie. By sending in requests in there, it's able to validate whether the first character is actually in the string or not. And so because cookies are made up of hexadecimal digits, right, or hexadecimal characters, you only have 16 permutations, 16 characters per position. So in 16 requests, you could now find and crack what the first character is, right? And so if you have a standard size, within 256 requests into the server, you've now been able to reconstruct the cookie. And now what you could do is you could do what's called the session hijacking, which is now you've got the user's cookie. I don't need to crack SSL encryption. I'm just coming in and I'm setting in my browser the cookie for the user, and I'm now essentially that user. So it's leveraging vulnerabilities in SSL as part of the encryption here, right, to take advantage of it. Later on, if I'm going from a new browser and talking to that server once I hijack the cookie and I've hijacked the session, I can use new communication algorithms, right, that are not crackable, not vulnerable, but it's okay. I've got your session cookie. I'm now you. I can do whatever I want with your bank account, right? Heartbleed is the last one I'm going to talk about, and that was fairly recent. That's about 4 years ago. This is not a man-in-the-middle attack. This is a vulnerability in OpenSSL. So this was something that you as a browser really, you as a user really didn't have much, I'd say, at that point in time, and it's been fixed. But what happened is, again, this is a buffer overflow situation. So in a heartbeat, in an SSL protocol, there's the ability for me to keep the communication line open with the server, keep the connection open. Okay, there's kind of a keep alive heartbeat, and so the client will send in and say, "Hey server, if you're still there, send me OK," which is 2 bytes in size, and server sends it back. But there was a vulnerability in certain versions of OpenSSL where the client would say, if you were a bad actor, you'd say, "Hey, send me OK if you're alive," but the OK size is this big. And so what would happen is that it would overrun the buffer, and a lot of times what would happen with that is that it would send you a bunch of stuff that it had in its buffer, including in some cases a copy of its private key. And now you've got the private key, and guess what?
You can be.
I'm going shopping, right? So here you can see a disclosure of actually a user password information, right? That's the danger of buffer overflow. We were playing around with buffer overflow last night, right, to essentially get access to a file that doesn't belong to us. So if your programs are susceptible to these buffer overflows and they're not coded correctly, which is what happened with OpenSSL in the specific scenario of the function that was controlling its heartbeat, it would bleed information that it shouldn't and would expose that private information out to attackers. Okay. OpenSSL has since been fixed, so that is no longer an issue. Of course, those that it's been fixed in a newer version of OpenSSL. If products are still using the older vulnerable versions of OpenSSL, they're still exposed. Which is the problem with that is that they had issues. Many devices were using OpenSSL vulnerable version, and so they were exposing those websites. Okay, last section. So, high level, right? How do you stay safe online, right? I mean, we talked about SSL is great, but it's very complex, and there are vulnerabilities, and I'm not trying to scare everybody, but there are things that you should be doing to stay safe online, right? Now, this is in context of you browsing the internet. Understand that SSL is also used for things like secure email exchange. So things are applicable when you're using secure communication to send and receive emails. This is when you're sending files, right? Some of the protocols like FTP and others that are important for file exchange, file download and upload. This is even used in secure messaging protocols where you're sending data back and forth. Okay, so what I'm talking about here specifically to you within the context of browsing and going out to websites. First thing is use the latest version of your browsers, right? And I've got a matrix on the next slide that shows you the latest versions and how they have, measure against some of the vulnerabilities or attacks that we've seen, as well as protocol support. You can check the configuration of your browser by actually going to a website called howsmyssl.com. I'm going to show you what that looks like. I'm going to switch over for a second. So here is an example of me testing, and this is testing your own client-side configuration. So you can see I'm actually using Chrome, and it's looking through, and it's saying, okay, talking about Cypher suites, right? So here you can actually see those, all right? Protocol, key exchange, signature, data, and MAC, right? You can start seeing these protocols, and you can start seeing the different ones, right? So it's looking through those, and they're saying they're good. This is what my client says it supports, so there's nothing in here that says that it's bad. Beast is another vulnerability, right? So it's saying it's good, it's not there. Ephemeral key supports, and we talked about the Diffie-Hellman exchange. There's a term that's used, it's called forward secrecy, perfect forward secrecy. And what's important here is, remember, because you're not exchanging the master key, then the master key, the session key is constructed from a master key that was derived from data that was never sent. So even if I get a hold of the server's private key later on, there's nothing in that that's going to allow me to figure out the session key that was derived, right? Because there was nothing that was exchanged and communicated using the server's public key. So therefore, even if I get a hold of the server's private key years from now, I can't use it to actually figure out the session key, and therefore I can't go and read that data later on. So it basically guarantees secrecy going forward, all right, into the future. And you can see my browser actually supports TLS version 1.3, which is good, right? If it said, if I had something like SSL 3 turned on, it would have been showing red. Pretty serious stuff. So howsmyssl.com, very good thing for you to, once you install a browser, just to go and test that. Good one. Okay. So that's the browser, and again, you should just upgrade and use setup to auto update or auto inform you when new versions are up there, and you should install it. The common browsers out there, right? Chrome, Firefox, IE, Edge, and Safari, right? Those are the 5 standard ones. People point to Opera and all those other ones. No, just those 5 is what I usually talk about. In terms of falling for man-in-the-middle attacks, right? So even if you had a really good browser, right, how do you protect from someone injecting themselves in the middle, right? So there's a couple of things that we talk about. So the first thing is you want to go when you want to, if you're going to kind of a website, or you want to check to make sure that the connection between you and the server is clean, and that there's not going to be any vulnerabilities, right? SSL Labs website, you can do an SSL test on a website, and it will tell you whether the website is vulnerable to certain attacks, whether it's vulnerable to attacks on key exchange, whether it's vulnerable to attacks on data exchange, right? So,
for the hackers also.
yes, because when you run by default, if you go in and do a search on a website and you don't click this, do not show, it's actually going to post it. Now, again, I can run against everything, but I'm just going to go in here and say, ooh, who's worse? Ooh, I'm going to go check this out. This looks like a fun one for me to try to mess with, right? So what this does, and I'll show you, I'm going to pick one. Let's just go this one here. I don't care. All right. So it's giving it an A+ rating. It's saying, okay, it supports, server supports 1.3, right? So remember, when you're talking SSL, TLS, both sides have to agree to the versions that they talk. So if I say I'm going to support TLS 1.3 for my browser, but the server is configured to only work with SSL 3, we're either not going to be able to talk, or if my browser supports falling back to SSL v3, that's the only language that we're going to speak together. Now we're going to talk over SSL v3. So even though I have the best browser, the latest browser, and configured to leverage the latest version of TLS, if the server doesn't support it and I'm talking to that server, I'm hosed potentially, right? So the server supports that. We talked about HSTS, right, which is the strict transport security, right, which basically means that it's going to force only communication over HTTPS. Most servers, web servers that you go to these days, most of the sites will do that, right? And it's also then, if you kind of scroll down and you can look at it, you can see the certificate information. Some of the things that you want to look at is the validity. So if it's expired, if its certificate is expired, it's going to show you here. The newer browsers will tell you if the certificate expired, but the older browsers may not, right? So this is, again, a good test for you to look and see. This is actually going to expire in a month and 26 days, and hopefully they're going to renew it, because I've been in situations where IT departments have forgotten about renewals of certificates, and then their websites all of a sudden stop working and people freak out. Let's see what else is kind of good to talk about. It talks about the certificate authority. What protocols it supports, right? And so the good news is it doesn't support SSL, but it does support TLS 1.0 and 1.1, which are not very secure. They have known vulnerabilities. So it's turned on. It's probably turned on for compatibility with older clients. A lot of times businesses would do that. But the good news is that it supports the newer versions that are good. And then, of course, you can see here that it walks through and it tells you what cipher suites, remember, we talked about it, right? Protocol, key exchange, signature, data exchange, and MAC, right? And so the green ones are good. Yellow ones here, or orange ones, they're weak, they're poor. RSA, remember we talked about it. This is where you're doing a key exchange by sending the pre-master key using the server's public key, right? So that tells me these are not good, right? Because this is why you want to use the Fidelman right there, right? You can see FS, which is forward secrecy. So these are the ones that actually give you forward secrecy, which is important. I think this one doesn't have, it does have this turned on. Let me see. Okay, so it doesn't have any really bad ones, right? Doesn't have any bad ones. Some of the failed servers, if we go back and take a look at one of the bad ones, let's go look at this one here. Actually, let's go do an F. Okay, so it supports SSL 2, right? It's vulnerable to Poodle. It supports RC4 cipher, which is well known for its weaknesses. Okay, and it's using a version of HTTPD, a version of the server, web server, that is buggy. Some of the things to look at here, right? If we look at it, it's using really bad, insecure algorithms here, or cipher suites for communication, right? So this is where it's supporting older browsers like IE6. God, I don't even know why people still use IE6, right? But it's, for instance, right there, it was able to negotiate using 3 DES, poor algorithm right there, right, for exchange and fairly vulnerable. That specific cipher was very vulnerable, especially with the SSL v3. So vulnerable to Poodle. They haven't